Tensions between Cambodia and Thailand have once again drawn international attention as Southeast Asia faces one of its most delicate diplomatic challenges in recent years. Amid growing fears that the fragile ceasefire along the disputed border could collapse, ASEAN leaders moved quickly to prevent another escalation. At the center of those efforts is Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who currently serves as ASEAN chair for 2026 and has stepped forward to mediate between the two neighboring nations. The urgent talks took place on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Sibu, where regional leaders gathered to address economic concerns, energy security, and rising geopolitical uncertainty across Asia. But among all the pressing issues on the agenda, the Cambodia-Thailand border situation emerged as one of the most sensitive discussions of the summit. The conflict between the two countries is deeply rooted in history. For decades, Cambodia and Thailand have disagreed over sections of their shared border, particularly areas surrounding ancient temple sites and strategically important territory. While periods of calm have existed in the past, tensions have repeatedly resurfaced whenever military activity increased or political rhetoric intensified on either side. The latest crisis began escalating in 2025 when clashes erupted near disputed border zones. What initially appeared to be isolated confrontations quickly developed into a dangerous military standoff involving artillery fire, troop deployments, and cross-border accusations. Thousands of civilians living near the border were forced to flee their homes as violence spread across affected regions. The situation alarmed ASEAN leaders who feared the conflict could destabilize Southeast Asia at a time when the region was already dealing with major global pressures. Economic uncertainty, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical competition between major world powers had already placed ASEAN under strain. Another armed conflict within the bloc threatened to weaken regional unity even further. After months of tension, diplomatic pressure from ASEAN eventually helped produce a ceasefire agreement in late 2025. The deal, signed during the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, included commitments from both Cambodia and Thailand to reduce military activity and reopen communication channels. However, despite the agreement, the peace remained fragile. In the months that followed, both sides continued accusing each other of violating the ceasefire. Reports of military movements, landmine incidents, and border provocations kept tensions alive, raising fears that fighting could resume at any moment. That uncertainty is what made the recent talks in Cebu so important. As ASEAN chair, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. invited Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet and Thai Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul to join urgent discussions aimed at preserving the ceasefire and rebuilding trust between the two governments. The Philippine president emphasized that ASEAN had a responsibility to ensure peace among its member states and prevent the dispute from escalating further. This meeting was arranged by the Philippines as a way to provide its good offices in our capacity as chair of ASEAN for 2026 to Cambodia and Thailand in order to provide a meaningful space for constructive dialogue on their bilateral border issues, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said. The statement reflected ASEAN's traditional approach to diplomacy, avoiding confrontation while encouraging dialogue and consensus behind closed doors. Unlike many international organizations that rely on sanctions or public pressure, ASEAN has historically preferred quiet negotiations and regional mediation. During the talks, leaders reportedly focused on practical steps to maintain stability along the border. Discussions included military restraint, communication mechanisms between armed forces, and ways to prevent accidental clashes from spiraling into wider conflict. Diplomatic officials described the atmosphere as cautious but constructive. Even though major disagreements remain unresolved, the fact that Cambodian and Thai leaders sat down together for direct talks was viewed as a positive development. Relations between the two countries had become increasingly tense after months of deadly confrontations, making face-to-face dialogue increasingly rare. ASEAN leaders also recognized that the dispute was no longer just a bilateral issue between Cambodia and Thailand. The conflict now carried broader implications for regional stability and investor confidence across Southeast Asia. At the same summit, ASEAN leaders were already discussing the impact of rising global tensions, particularly concerns linked to instability in the Middle East and disruptions to energy markets. Many Southeast Asian economies depend heavily on imported fuel, and fears of rising oil prices have placed additional pressure on governments across the region. Against that backdrop, another military crisis within ASEAN itself was seen as something the bloc simply could not afford. Regional officials privately pushed both Cambodia and Thailand to avoid inflammatory rhetoric and focus instead on confidence-building measures that could gradually reduce mistrust. Those measures may include military hotlines, coordinated monitoring systems, and expanded observer missions near disputed areas. One of ASEAN's most important tools in maintaining calm has been the ASEAN Observer Team, which was strengthened after the 2025 clashes. The observer mission, currently coordinated by the Philippines, is tasked with monitoring ceasefire compliance and helping reduce the risk of renewed violence. While relatively limited in scale, the mission carries strong symbolic importance because it represents ASEAN's attempt to solve regional problems internally without relying on outside powers. That effort is particularly significant at a time when geopolitical competition in Asia continues to intensify. Southeast Asia has increasingly become a strategic battleground for influence between major global powers, especially the United States and China. Asian leaders have repeatedly stressed the importance of maintaining regional unity and preventing internal conflicts from making the bloc more vulnerable to external pressure. For ASEAN, preserving stability between Cambodia and Thailand is therefore about more than just border security. It is also about protecting the credibility and unity of the organization itself. Analysts say ASEAN's reputation could suffer if it fails to prevent future violence between two of its own members. Critics have often argued that the bloc moves too slowly during crises and struggles to enforce agreements when tensions rise. That is why the diplomatic efforts in Sibu are being closely watched across the region. During the summit, the Philippine president expressed confidence that both governments were capable of resolving their differences peacefully. We express our confidence in the ability of both Cambodia and Thailand to resolve the matter amicably and to manage their border differences, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said after the talks. The message was carefully crafted to encourage cooperation without publicly blaming either side. So far, both Cambodia and Thailand appear willing to continue diplomatic engagement, although deep mistrust still remains beneath the surface. Military observers note that troops from both countries continue maintaining positions near disputed areas, while nationalist sentiment remains politically sensitive inside both nations. Border disputes have historically triggered strong emotional reactions among the public, making compromise politically difficult for leaders on either side. That political pressure is one reason why previous peace efforts have often struggled to produce lasting solutions. Still, regional diplomats believe sustained dialogue could gradually reduce tensions over time, especially if both governments continue participating in ASEAN-led negotiations. For ordinary civilians living near the border, the hope is simply that the violence does not return. The clashes of 2025 left communities deeply shaken. Families were displaced, local economies were disrupted, and fear spread across areas that had previously enjoyed relative stability. Even after the ceasefire, uncertainty continued affecting trade, transportation, and daily life in border provinces. Businesses operating near affected areas also suffered losses as border crossings became restricted and tourism declined. ASEAN leaders understand that another major escalation could carry serious humanitarian and economic consequences, not only for Cambodia and Thailand, but for the wider region as well. That broader concern helped create momentum for the Sibu talks. Officials familiar with the discussions say ASEAN members encourage both governments to treat the current dialogue as the beginning of a long-term stabilization process rather than a temporary political gesture. The road ahead, however, remains difficult. Key issues surrounding border demarcation and territorial claims are still unresolved, and there is no guarantee that future incidents will not trigger renewed tensions. But for now, the ceasefire is holding. The direct talks between Cambodian and Thai leaders, facilitated by the Philippines under ASEAN leadership, have at least reopened diplomatic channels at a critical moment. Regional analysts believe continued communication will be essential in preventing misunderstandings or isolated incidents from escalating into larger military confrontations. The summit in Cebu ultimately highlighted how interconnected Southeast Asia's challenges have become, from border disputes and security tensions to energy concerns and economic uncertainty. ASEAN leaders are increasingly recognizing that regional stability depends on cooperation and diplomacy rather than confrontation. For Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the talks also represented an important test of ASEAN leadership under the Philippines' chairmanship. By stepping into a mediating role, the Philippines signaled its intention to play a more active part in regional diplomacy and conflict resolution. Whether those efforts will produce long-term peace remains uncertain, but for now, Asian leaders appear determined to keep communication alive and prevent another dangerous escalation between Cambodia and Thailand. As the summit concluded, one message became clear: Southeast Asia cannot afford another conflict within its own borders. The fragile ceasefire may still face challenges in the months ahead, but the renewed diplomatic momentum generated in Sibu has at least created a window for dialogue and possibly a path toward lasting stability.